Sue Mays, this is an absolute thrill for me as a sports physio to have some time with you talking about foot and ankles. Welcome to the Physical Performance Show.
Thanks, Brad. Thanks for the invitation.
Sue, we've set ourselves a lofty target today to talk about foot and ankle conditions in general, but that's what we'll endeavour to do. But as per your bio, which I mentioned at the top of the show here, it's been a big year of few months of you for change, hasn't it? Can you just take us through how you've been adapting to what I think was 32 years at the Australian Ballet as the lead physiotherapist, the head of artistic health, I think it was, or what the title was, but 30 plus years, you were the heart and soul, and now you're over as senior lecturer at Trobe Uni. How have you been going with that change?
I've actually really loved it. I was in my 30th year at the ballet. It's taken over my whole life pretty much, and I've loved every moment of it. But it was just an opportunity came up, and I started to think about really trying to help this new generation of physios improve their skills. And I just inquired about, would I need to get any further sort of education to be able to teach? And they said, no, you could, you've got your PhD, you've got the experience, and there's a position coming up. So it was just like this amazing timing. So it was a very quick sort of transition. And I've just dived into it. I love it. I'm teaching sort of right across the board. I've got second year physio students, teaching them lower limb, which is really fun. And then I teach into the postgraduate, the Masters in Musculoskeletal Sports Physio course as well. And I'm also developing curriculum. So as of yesterday, I've taken on leading the curriculum development for the first year. So the La Trobe course is doing an overhaul and redevelopment of all their curriculum for the bachelor degree, which is so exciting. So I get to be a part of, really developing this and looking at, what we've got and restructuring it. So it's exciting to get an opportunity to be a part of that.
Well, the new generation is very fortunate. I joke that I'm coming back to uni if you're now teaching. You're also still researching, I believe, and right through I think many of your years at the Australian Ballet, you were an adjunct research fellow at La Trobe, and you did your PhD there, looking at hip joint health in professional ballet dancers. What research interests or projects have you got going at the moment?
Yeah, so the role is a teaching and research role. So I spend a couple of days researching. So we've got the research partnership between La Trobe Uni and the Australian Ballet. So within that, we've got numerous studies. We've got 7 active studies at the moment, and they're really diverse. So there's a study looking at foot that I'm leading. So we've MRI'd dancers and recreational runners' feet, and we're looking at the imaging findings and seeing if it correlates with their symptoms and some of their clinical measures. And we've got a pelvic floor study, which is really exciting. So looking at pelvic floor issues in performing artists, and that's not just dancers, but even musicians. And we're sort of coming to the end of a mental fatigue study, but I'd really love to see this continue on. And I think it's just such an important issue with particularly ankle sprains. The dancers identified that, our most common time to see an ankle sprain is at the end of the day when they start to get mentally and physically fatigued, but they really, they start to switch off. Or they will explain that they've been thrown in with some new choreography that they're really, mentally having to really concentrate. And that's again another time. And it's usually again at the end of that rehearsal when they're mentally sort of fatigued because it's such a challenging occupation. They're learning choreography on the spot, and they're in front of their peers, like very demanding, very physically demanding, but so mentally demanding because all day long they're learning new work and they are amazing at what they can do at the last minute. We've had dancers who've sprained their ankle on stage and will just jump into their spot and they could be doing the same movements, but have to do it on completely the opposite side, on the opposite side of the stage. So they're very quick to adapt, but it is a mental strain. So I'd really love to see that research continue. But yeah, we've got a great little study over in South Africa where the researcher has looked at implementing calf raises and some sort of ideas about preventing injury and education in recreational ballet schools. And the findings of that are interesting. Basically, really demonstrates that we need to get the coaches on board. They're with those young students, doing the training, and without their sort of belief and education in what we're trying to achieve, it's really hard to get these young kids to adhere to programs. So I think our focus needs to be on really educating and getting good relationships with the coaches and building up their trust that they can start to implement some of our ideas.
And what are those ideas, Sue, while we're on that chain of conversation?
Good question. So I think one of the key things is getting some good strength through the muscles. So I think there's been this myth, particularly in the artistic world, where, if you strengthen up the muscles, you'll end up with bulky muscles that will make the aesthetic not look so appealing, but also it actually they might feel a bit restricted. And this idea that it'll make them tight. And so then the other side of that is trying to stop them doing all this excessive stretching. So a good example of this is the calf strength. So back in 2003, we screened the whole company. We had pretty basic tests back in those days. But the only thing that really correlated with injury was poor calf endurance. And I was astonished that these professional ballet dancers could only do about 8 calf raises. And so we started at that point, we tried to get the dancers we educated them and explained how important they are. But, we had about a third uptake. So because post impingement was our most common injury, and we often had people having surgery and being off for extended periods of time, the staff agreed that we could introduce the calf raise into a ballet class, which was like this ballet class is such a traditional that's been around for 100 years or more. So to really be able to intervene and put these calf raises into such a traditional framework was very exciting and such a privilege. And so we had them put into just the end of bar. The bar is where they hold on to the wooden bar thing. And so just before they finish that, they add in some calf raises. So at that point, because it was a new exercise, we just got them to do 16 on each leg. And after 6 weeks, it was the women that came to us and said, we're actually starting to feel the benefits already. 16 is now easy. Can we go up to 24? And it's 24, not 25, because it's all got to be to the music. So you don't have 25 beats generally in the music. So then we upped it to 24, and now we provide, 36 beats for them to do the calf raises. But over the next few years, we saw a really remarkable reduction in most of our injuries, but particularly the posterior ankle pain, posterior impingement. We've rarely done a surgery since then. Our stress fracture rates are extremely low, average 1 a year. So it really did have a fantastic impact on our injury rates and the severity of the injuries, and the dancers felt the benefit. So now this exercise has been implemented by companies and schools all over the world, and lots of anecdotal evidence that it's really helpful. It's certainly Charlotte Ganderton did a study on the circus and found that they only did it for 9 weeks. So I think you'd need a bit longer to see a really good impact on injury rates, but there was no negative impact from them, which I think was important because the coaches or ballet staff are always worried that they're going to overload their calves or that they might increase the risk of injury because their calves are fatigued. But there was definitely no negative impact. And anecdotally, the circus performers found that they got some benefit out of it. So it's a safe exercise. The other point of that at that same time is that we actually stop them calf stretching. So at the time, we had these wooden decline boards in each of the studios for them specifically to stretch their calves out. And they would literally be stretching all through class, all through their day. And I actually went to an operation by Kim Slater, who's the surgeon up in Sydney. And we had a dancer with a longitudinal tear in her FHL, or flexor hallucis longus tendon. And when he operated, obviously that's where he revealed it. And I actually asked him to put the ankle in full dorsiflexion with the hallux extended as well. So that sort of full stretch of the FHL. And where the tear was sitting was right at the posterior edge of that talus. So it makes quite a sharp angle at the posterior talus and great potential there for compression and shearing of that tendon. So once I saw that, I thought, wow, if these dancers are sort of putting so much load through this FHL, they're potentially going to be injuring it further, putting them into this extreme sort of stretch position. So I gave them an education session, showed them the anatomy, explained why putting the, heel off the step even for prolonged amounts of time was probably potentially irritating that tendon, and perhaps there's better ways of getting their flexibility. And so we stopped because, the natural thing after you do some calf raises is to go straight into a stretch. So I said, you don't need to do that. Just give your calf a bit of a shake, get rid of all that tension. Let's take all those calf stretches out. So we took them all out. And I don't think you'll ever see an Australian ballet dancer at the professional level doing a calf stretch anymore. And even though, so that's, over 20 years of no calf stretching, they certainly, there's been no negative impact. They haven't lost their range of movement. They can jump better than ever. They're far less injured. So, I think that sort of, anecdotally supports that we don't really need to be sort of stretching out these calves. And if you think, why are they doing it? It's usually tightness at the back of the ankle that limits their dorsiflexion. And I think this goes for, all athletes and, whether they're recreational or professional, that usually your dorsiflexion or your, the lunge position, it's not the calf that's limiting you. It's usually the posterior capsule of the ankle joint or the subtalar joint. And often if you're doing exercise at that level, you get a little bit of swelling in the capsule. And we demonstrated this with some research that was led by Peter Bailey, and we did MRIs of the professional ballet dancers and we compared them with fast bowlers. So we looked at their front leg because it often is prone to posterior ankle pain and swelling. In fact, at that point, when we started the research, because the Cricket Australia were having such a problem with their posterior impingements, that they got me in to have a chat to them, and they were operating on nearly all the fast bowlers' front ankles because when they would operate, they'd find a ostrigonum. And so that was, assumed to be the source of their symptoms. So they would have operation to remove this. So so we were keen to look at the posterior structures of the ankle because we also find it in ballet, from a very young age, a dancer might get posterior ankle pain. They go to the, GP or physio, they do an X-ray and they find an ostrigonum, which is this part, extra sort of accessory bone at the back of the ankle. But in fact, it was always meant to be there. It's a secondary ossification center. So it's always a separate structure in a child. And it fuses in sort of once they move out of adolescence. So, potentially these young little 14 or 15-year-old dancers who have suddenly just upped their workload, develop post-impingement. I mean, there's potential that has not even fused yet. But for some reason, they don't fuse. And then that is called an ostrigonum. So we were keen because there are a lot of dancers finding this ostrigonum on their imaging and then going straight to surgery, assuming that that was, the problem. So we were really keen to investigate it, as was the cricket. So they helped fund it. So we MRI'd, as I said, all the dancers and the fast bowlers, and we found a really high prevalence of either an ostrigonum or an elongation of this posterior process called a Steeder's process. So if we looked at the dancers, about 50% of them had either an osteogonum or a Steeder's process, and either could cause, potentially cause impingement. The female athletes were the same prevalence, but the male fast bowlers had a 90% prevalence of either having an osteogonum or a Steeder's process. So it was no wonder that they were, all going off for surgery. So that's really had a great impact because now it's, much less common to operate on these groups. And as I said, we haven't had to do one of these operations for, well, about 15 years and probably one in about 20 years. So it can be really managed. It's the symptoms that we need to manage. And often it's the swelling in that posterior capsule, because what we also found when we did the imaging was just about everyone had some effusion in the ankle or subtalar joint. So if you get a little bit of swelling in the back of that recess, in the back of that ankle, when you go into a lunge, that's going to, cause a bit of pressure and limit your range of movement. And I find that that's usually the cause of their problem, or stiffness around either the ankle joint or the subtalar joint. But there's other joints that also give you that lunge position. You've got joints in your midfoot. So I often find that certainly if someone's been injured for a while, there'll be a bit of stiffness there. So that's a great target for physios as well if you're trying to get more range of movement around that ankle into that dorsiflexion.
Sue, that's a masterclass right there. I was busy taking notes and absorbing it all in. Is there anything you wanted to add, though? I think I might have cut you off there. I'm sorry.
No, you didn't.
Okay.
I think, basically the message of that is though that just about everyone that we tested had imaging findings, had something that they could see. And sometimes the smallest little things like cysts or swelling glow, they look quite phenomenal because they're white. So it can be really negative for a dancer or an athlete to sort of see these images, especially when they're blown up on a big screen. And we found no correlation between any of these imaging findings and the symptoms. So, we really need to improve and to use our clinical examination, because that is quite accurate. And really, we should be looking at the impairments and not physical and, impairments, and not focusing on these imaging findings. They can be really helpful to confirm our diagnosis, but they certainly shouldn't be the first thing we go to. And if someone comes into me, it's the last thing I'll look at. I don't want to be swayed. I'll keep it to the side. The patient's usually dying for you to have a look at their images, but I try to leave it to the end so I'm not biased.
Yeah. I mean, I've had the pleasure of working with some young dancers and with some posterior ankle, symptoms, and the challenge of imaging and also societal beliefs, ingrained dancing beliefs. I've had quite a few conversations around we don't need to go direct to an orthopedic surgeon. This
Yes.
this has scope to be managed, but I've found it quite challenging at times to be able to hold the line and not overcome some of those beliefs that are built up through, in this case, the dancing community and concerned parents. Oh, someone had a surgery, your child should too. It can be quite tough, right?
Yeah, it's they're especially around that sort of 15-year-old age where they've suddenly started potentially, a lot higher hours of and intensity of dancing. And you've got, that at this point they're really starting to think about a career. And they want to fix everything up before they start. They've got this idea that, if I have surgery now, my progression won't be interrupted. And I've had people that have, imaged both ankles and completely asymptomatic on the other side, but because they've got an osteogonum on both sides, they've like, well, we better get it operated now, before it causes a problem. And that's frightening because surgery, it's very rare not to lose range of movement with surgery. They'll never get more range. So that's another myth. They can see this little extra bone that looks like it's got no value, but to impinge or restrict their point or plantar flexion. So why not take it out? It doesn't seem like it's got much of a role, and maybe I'll get more movement back, but you do not get, like, this is a pain relieving procedure. They won't get more point, and very often they'll lose their dorsiflexion or their plie or their lunge. And that, though it might cure their ankle pain, often then causes loading to the forefoot. So then they might develop stress fractures through the base of the second metatarsal, or they might develop hip pain because they haven't got as much plie or that lunge position. There's nearly always a repercussion once they start opening up a joint and operating on it. It's very rare not to lose some range of movement. So yeah, I really, it's last resort. I mean, you've got to be trying absolutely everything before you go down that road.
One barrier I've encountered in the developing dancing population is at a professional level or something like the Australian Ballet, where there's ingrained or in-house strength and conditioning facilities and access to it. I find it such a challenge to, and understandably, with these busy schedules, big hours, be able to incorporate the strength and conditioning at the level it probably needs to be, i.e., accessing some gym equipment when they're already maxed out across school, dance. I found that a real challenge, Sue.
Yeah, they do lots of hours, don't they? They're just about every day. I think we all need to be careful not to give anyone, whether they're professional or, the younger ones, too many exercises. Like, picking three or four really great exercises, making them efficient. I think dancers love to turn up early. I mean, they're diligent. Like if you tell them to do 50, they'll do 100. So I think giving them exercises before they go into their training is a really good strategy because often they'll turn up, they'll spend all this time stretching, they'll spend an hour stretching. If you can start to shift that to let's add in three or four exercises into this pre-class time. That's a really good opportunity because it warms the joints up. It gives, I'll demonstrate to them, like I'll get them to do like a knee to wall test or, test their dorsiflexion range of movement, get them to do some calf raises, reassess their knee to wall, and invariably they've gained a centimetre or two. So it just demonstrates to them that you won't lose range. It actually will warm things up. So, do some calf raises or some foot intrinsics or, a couple of hip exercises before you go in. It's going to really set you up well for your training. But, it's a key time where they're probably, if they're not doing that, they're going to be lying around stretching in the side splits.
Yeah, and you mentioned you mentioned some of the perils of stretching, and it's not a loaded question, but it's one that I think practitioners would get if they did that intervention retest, like you just said, do a lunge to the wall or a knee to
Mm.
wall test, do some calf raises and check it. What's the mechanism behind that? Is why do people get better range from recruiting muscles around the ankle slash foot?
Yeah, well, I think you start to, I mean, the tissue can be a bit stiff and, you get the tendon gliding, you get the joint gliding better, you get a bit more sort of the muscles warmed up rather than sort of just being stretched. You get more, the improved blood supply, getting the fluid, the synovial fluid moving through the joint. So I think there's, and then obviously getting better activation and support through the muscles.
Yeah, yeah, great. And just on that line of thinking, Sue, are there any other go tos for the athlete or dancer with a stiff front of the ankle, so talocrural joint? You've
Yeah.
just mentioned calf raises. You mentioned some of the concern about incline boards and stretching in terms of the FHL. What would be some good go tos people can deploy in the studio or at home?
Yeah, so they're always sort of, I mean, I did it too. I used to have my great big 6 foot three father sit on my feet to try to stretch them out. The piano is another common one. So I'd really encourage people not to do that. If you sort of really force that plantar flexion or the point position, it is just going to jam up the tissues at the back of the ankle and potentially cause some pain. So we've had, even at the professional level, we'll have dancers that don't have the perfect point, but it's how they use it. So strengthening up not just the calf, but also the foot muscles can really improve your range of movement. And starting that from a very young age has the potential to really sort of develop a nice point position. So just a passive stretch of the capsule of those like ligaments is really not going to have much of an impact. But definitely strengthening those foot and calf muscles can have a great impact. And, if you've got this floppy, passive, stretched foot or whatever you're doing, it's not going to work unless you've got the strength to support it. So we would, and the dancers do a little regime of foot strengthening exercises in the morning. They do their calf raises, and they'll do a little bit more during class at that, the break between the bar and the center. And then they might do some more heavy resistance later on in the day when they're not fatigued. But again, it's just finding those little moments to pop them in. So they might do, that we travel a lot, so we don't often have all the big heavy gym equipment. So we've had to be pretty creative with some of the exercises that we've done. So, using stuff around the house or, a backpack with weights on, and, you've got to be pretty creative when you're away from home all the time. So I think, lots of those ideas are out there where you can use stuff around the house.
So I guess the takeaway there, Sue, is if you're working with athletes, you really have to make any intervention doable. It's no point having a big long list. It's, build it into their day. If we're talking dancing in the studio, if they're a traveling athlete without access to gym gear, get creative. But I think the takeaway is it can be done.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, our population, they have extraordinarily long days. They start at, 10:30 in the morning, they finish at 6:30 at night. That's when they're not performing. And when they're performing, they still start at 10:30 or 11, and they finish at 10:30 at night. And so it's finding those little moments and just understanding that there's going to be periods where they're not going to have time. So maybe when they do have time, before they get to that really heavy congestion, they really get some good strength up. So then they just sort of can maintain during those really heavy times. But yeah, finding those little opportunities where they can really push, get over all their DOMs or, their delayed muscle soreness in the less crucial times, keeping something going in holidays, like not just completely resting 100% is another key time. So that would be a great time to sort of, have a bit of a rest for a couple of weeks, but, use the last 2 weeks to really build up some strength again so that they're ready. Because we've certainly found that the most common time for stress fractures, for example, is in that first few weeks back after a break. The most common stress fracture we used to see was the metatarsal stress fracture, and in particular the base of second, which is a high risk stress fracture, which means it's prone to not heal and can have long-term pain and, poor function. So that has been a really important one that we've been quite successful in preventing. And the key to that is reminding them and education. So, and also a gradual build up. So as soon as they get back after a break, we've got this graduated return to work policy where they've got 2 weeks to sort of build up their load. It's still pretty short, but they've got their shows in 5 weeks, so we can't take too long. So they build up their sort of intensity, the hours that they're on their feet over this 2 week period. But the stress fractures, unlike a tendon, which you usually feel within the next 2 or 3 days, bone stress injuries are tricky because you often don't feel it to about, the second or third week after they get back. So we send out a little infographic, a little reminder, nice little reminder picture. If you've got any cramping in the foot, come and get checked. So the advantage of being with them full time, back in the days where we used to get stress fractures all the time, was that I got to see what was happening beforehand. And the most common symptom that they complained about was foot cramping, sort of leading up to a stress fracture. So now we get them not to ignore foot cramping, which is really common. Like most athletes ignore foot cramping because they get it all the time. So if they have any foot cramping, they're to come in, we palpate those high risk foot. So that's the base of second, even the navicular. And if there's any sensitivity, we immediately back them off and just give it, they sort of take about 2 weeks to catch up. So we then just give it a bit of a 2 week period where they just gradually build up again. And most of the time that's enough. That's all they need to settle down. Like within a few days, it's all calmed down again, and we just make sure that it's a gradual build. But that's really, I mean, we've only had about 2 base and second stress fractures in 20 years. So we've got lots of reactions, but I think we're really good at preventing them from going on to fracture.
And in that example, Sue, like the dancing population in your environment, formerly professional dancing, with picking up that early, was that involving imaging as well, or just palpation? And then you mentioned the calming them back down over 2 weeks. You've mentioned over your years teaching the ill effects of boots, moon boots, etc.,
Yes.
beyond what's needed. But yeah, what's the management exactly look like after you do pick up that tenderness?
Yeah, so if it's really mild and they've had very little symptom and it's more, just more cramping, maybe just very low grade symptom. If they settle down a meet, like they should really be pain free with or no symptom within a few days. So if those symptoms aren't settling, and certainly if they came in and they had pain with walking or pain with hopping, we might go straight to imaging. But if it's that very low grade symptom and they've settled down within a few days, I'm pretty confident that they're going to be able to build up. But at the end of the 2 weeks, once they're back to full again, if they're still symptomatic, we'd certainly image, or any time along that sort of 2 week time frame. If they're not settling, then we'd image. But we don't need to jump in, otherwise we'd be imaging a lot of people because there's a lot that start to get a little bit of bone stress around that period. So if they were more symptomatic and we did get some imaging, usually we're picking it up at the bone stress, bone edema stage where there's no crack. If there is a crack, then we get a CT just to get a better, because the MRI is good at picking them up. It'll show all the edema, but it's not as good as a CT to really characterize that bone, like to be really accurate about the actual fracture line. And sometimes the MRI can miss it. So we get a CT just to confirm it. And then, so if it's the tricky thing with imaging though, it's always delayed. So that first image indicates that there's something going on. So then, for example, with a base of second or these high risk, this is a high risk one. So we'd be non-weight bearing, but we don't boot them. They need to keep moving their ankle. If you immobilize a dancer's ankle and foot for more than 3 weeks, that could be career ending. Like they should not be immobilized. And this stress fracture does heal well, but they just, they're not moving around too much, but they should not be immobilized. Whereas a navicular needs to be immobilized. So there's the big difference between the two, but they should be both non-weight bearing. So we'd do that for 4 to 6 weeks, same with a navicular, and then partial weight bearing for a couple of weeks, and then gradually building up. And it can take, 6 months, sometimes a year for a really bad one. So they're not a 6 weeker. They've been off and they've deconditioned in that time. So they need quite a long time to build their loads up again. So yeah, so once they've fractured though, I do find that they become symptomatic every time they really ramp up their loads, even though you've got full healing. And that's why the prevention is just so important, because it's pretty rare that, at a very high level, they will be asymptomatic, even if you've done the perfect rehab. Now, coming back to the imaging, it's so interesting. So you image that the first time, and then we'll repeat the imaging generally at 6 weeks. And this relates to any fracture or stress fracture. At that next one, it can actually look worse. It's this bizarre phenomenon where the imaging is often delayed. So I use that. So that 6 week imaging is kind of your baseline. So from then, if you repeat it another 6 weeks, it should have improved from then. But the stress fracture can look worse because the bone is resorbing and it's trying to heal. So you'll see all this bony resorption, which looks like it's getting worse. But I want to see a difference. If that imaging looks no difference, I'm concerned that there's failed healing and it's a non-union. So to see it look worse is actually a good sign because it is actually active. It's trying to heal. So that's a fantastic sign. but just respecting that 6-week imaging will probably look worse than the first one, and it's no benefit doing it before 6 weeks. We want to wait the full 6 weeks before we re-image because this really might not see too much change within that period of time. And then after, for a base a second, often we don't do too much repeated imaging because I find the clinical presentation is really quite accurate. So palpation is accurate, not so accurate with naviculars. So I've had naviculars that are you poke around and there's no pain, and then they've got a fracture on imaging. So, but I do find the base of second quite accurate, but we've just got to be careful. Dancers in particular are great at poking around their feet to check, and they'll often come in with bruises around their injury because they've been testing it incessantly. So I get them not to touch it. We don't want them to hypersensitize that area either by constantly sort of checking. But I think they shouldn't be touching it. And then I wouldn't be doing it all the time either. I would be at most once a week. But even, unless it's going to change my management, there's no need to be, checking it all the time because it can sort of aggravate it if you're pressing on it all the time.
Makes sense. And Sue, just to clarify, with the repeat imaging, would you be doing that for stress reactions or only if there's a cortical breach like a stress fracture? And would that delayed imaging that you're observing where it's worsening because of the resorption that's taking part, are you looking for that on the stress reactions or only just the frank cortical breaches, the fractures?
Yeah, I think if they remain symptomatic, you'd want to repeat it because perhaps that very first one looked like bone edema, but the second one might show a little crack because, as I say, there can be this weird delay. So if they're asymptomatic and they've returned and all's going well clinically, I'm happy. But if and certainly I'm a far more keen to image for a navicular. They are notoriously tricky. They're not very symptomatic. I've had completely asymptomatic athletes with a navicular stress fracture or fracture. So yeah, they're often, very rarely will they point to the navicular. I've had, they'll have usually cramping in the medial foot muscles. I've had someone with a navicular stress fracture that was nearly all the way through and he only had lateral foot pain. And same with even base of second. I've had base of second stress fractures where they've had lateral foot pain and it's been treated as a cuboid injury. So I think the midfoot's really complex, because of the keystone and this complex sort of arrangement of the bones. Any dysfunction on one side of the midfoot can impact the lateral. So if anyone comes with any midfoot pain or forefoot pain, I'm palpating those high risk navicular and base of second in particular.
So yeah, it's fascinating that people can have bone injuries there on those local bones, like you just mentioned, and not be symptomatic there.
Yeah, it's crazy. Like I've had, the no symptom, and then they've had this sudden played a game and then suddenly got pain, imaged, and they've already got a decent crack, no lead up, which is really tough to try to prevent them. I often find with the naviculars, once they're symptomatic, you're generally always, it's pretty rare actually to pick them up in the bone edema stress reaction phase. They've often already got a little defect.
And the management of the defect in the cortex or the shell of the bone in these naviculars. So conservative, surgical, depends on the grade. What's been your experience there?
Yeah, I really encourage people to try non-surgical. You know, you read, and this is an area where I'd really love to sort of look into more a clinical series because problem with naviculars, they're just no one, it's just inconsistent management, whether it's non-surgical or surgical. And I think we really need to, and I'm quite keen to look at this, really need to come up with a better sort of standardized approach that everyone is using. So I definitely encourage everyone to try non-surgical because once you put a screw through a bone, it's never the same. So, and I've certainly seen if they fail, that is career ending. It's very rare for them to be able to come back after a failed operation. So a non-surgical approach I use would be the non-weight bearing in a air cast for, so we used to plaster them in the old days, but an air cast non-weight bearing for 6 weeks and a couple of weeks of sort of partial weight bearing. But I don't want them to stay in that boot for too long because the problem with the boot is they don't move their ankle. And one of the issues with navicular stress fractures is stiffness around their ankle and a lack of dorsiflexion, which then jams up and impinges the navicular. But also, so we know that there's study that shows that as you lift the heel, that very initial heel lift, you actually get dorsiflexion and therefore dorsal impingement of the navicular in that initial heel raise position. So walking around is a bad thing for naviculars because that's what you're doing all the time. But I think it's more than just that dorsal impingement. And again, we don't really know what the mechanism of them is, but I often see them, most often see them in people that are excessively pronating or really weak through that midfoot and then drop into a bit of pronation. So I think it's sort of almost like a corkscrew effect of the talus into the navicular, where it sort of really sort of can stress those two parts because these fractures are, sort of sagittal down through that navicular, starting usually on the dorsal surface, coming down. So I look at both those movements. So if you've got someone with a lack of dorsiflexion, they're not only going to impinge anteriorly, but they're going to fall into some pronation to get more range, and then that potentially stresses the navicular with that torsion. And as we know from most stress fractures, there's usually a torsion component to them. It's usually not just a bending force. You've usually got torsion. So put them in a boot, they're going to lose their dorsiflexion, they're going to lose their calf, and it's going to take a lot more. And in a boot, you don't really support pronation. Like you stop their dorsiflexion, but you're not, this flat foot sitting in a cam boot is not supported. So at the very least, I'd get them to put a form orthotic or some kind of support into the boot, so they've actually got a bit of support in there. So yeah, so then it's a very slow return, and they take at least 6 months, even up to a year, any time from 6 to a year to repair, much like a base of second. But there are, yeah, much trickier ones. So I definitely would try non-surgical and exhaust that option first. And I've had lots of success with bringing them back non-surgically. But yeah, once they've had surgery, then I mean, it's amazing the variability in management. And that's where I think we really, and I'm keen to look into this, really like to come up with a standardized approach post-op as well.
Yeah, gosh. And Sue, you've mentioned the aircast splints. I know off air I've engaged you on some feedback on some deload management options for some ballet dancers, and you've often pointed out the aircast. That seems to be something that has good utility for offsetting some of the ill effects of being in a boot for any longer than is absolutely necessary.
Yeah, well, I mean, I just try to get them out of any form of boot. The
Mm.
problem with the boot, whether it's aircast or cam, is that they still hobble around. Like as soon as they can put weight through it, they're hobbling around, they're doing too much, the leg's dependent, so it means that swelling will stay in the foot. So as soon as I can get them out of that cam boot or air cast, I'd like to get them into a really solid shoe that supports the foot but doesn't limit their dorsiflexion. So, if I've got a athlete, I might get them into one of those carbon fiber shoes or a rocker shoe where they're not having to use their foot too much for walking, but I don't want them to be in that shoe all the time because then they're not going to build up any intrinsic foot strength or their calf. So you don't use your foot or your calf when you wear these shoes, which is a real problem because when they hit the market and they were super popular, I did see a rise in foot stress fractures, and I wonder if it was because their intrinsic feet got quite weak. So I would use it as a little bit of an adjunct. So maybe if they've got to do, go shopping or they've got unavoidable walking, because walking is the worst thing for a foot injury. So if they've got to do unavoidable walking, then maybe put this really solid shoe on, or a worker's boot or a hiking boot, something with quite a solid shoe that gives them heaps of support. Their foot doesn't have to work too hard. And they need a bit of a heel raise too, because we don't want them going from that neutral, that very initial heel raise as they walk, dorsiflexes or lowers that midfoot, which impinges on the dorsal surface of the navicular. So, and that's quite a stressful movement for the midfoot. So any midfoot injuries definitely need to have a little bit of an increased heel height. So you've got that pitch, so you get them out of that initial dorsiflexion. So that can sort of offload that midfoot area. So a little bit of a heel,
How many
which,
millimeters are we talking, Sue?
well, just a normal stack that you'd probably find in a typical runner, sort of a couple of centimeters. So that, and then, yeah, wearing runners, not flat, get them out of the Vans and Converse and all those shoes, get them into a proper runner that they've got that heel raise in them, or add a little bit of a heel raise. And yeah, just minimize walking basically. So the sorts of exercises I really love for foot injuries are obviously getting your calf strong, soleus, gastroc, foot intrinsics. But my favorite one is stair walking to stair running. And then why I love this so much, and I have tried it on absolutely every foot and ankle injury you could imagine, and it's really well tolerated from a very early phase. So fantastic for plantar fascia problems. Um, they start with their heel lifted. And so if you imagine that the first MTP joint or your big toe joint is about 30 degrees of extension or dorsiflexion, and they've got to hold that position all the way up and all the way down the stairs. And even on the landings, they keep that heel in a raised position. So you get this massive sort of isometric contraction. It's the position of 30 degrees of extension of the big toe joint puts sort of maximal tension on your plantar fascia and your intrinsic muscles. So they're working pretty hard at that point. Got all the body weight going through the foot. So for example, with a plantar fascia injury, they'll feel like a bit of a buzzy feeling through their foot, which is good. And it's a good workout for the calf as well. So we'll start quite slow. So a stepping, speed of about 90 beats a minute. And I'll just do a minute or maybe even a few flights for the very first time. But what I like about it's really well measured and really specific. So you use your metronome, you set it at 90 beats a minute, you set it for 1 minute, and that's all you do. And then you reassess and see how it feels over the next couple of days. And then the next time you can either increase the speed or increase the duration. And so it's very progressive, great for bone stress injuries where you've got to be really specific about your loads. And basically, your speed is dictated by your technique or your form. So if they can't keep that heel lifted in this position, then you increase the duration. And if they've got great technique, you can increase the speed. So we get, about the time you get to a speed of 135 or 140 beats a minute, then I transition people to a jog. And so then they're jogging for whatever minutes you've set. And then by the end of it, I mean, we've got athletes and dancers up to 200 beats a minute for up to 20 minutes, which is a massive cardio workout. So it's a good thing for the cardio when they're on a big rehab. But, 10 to 15 minutes is, ideal. Even 15 minutes would be the most ideal at about, these high speeds. So they're getting a good workout. I find that at about 150 beats a minute, if they could do it for 10 minutes, really transition well to running on the track. So it's a nice way to get, because there's a big, like to start running with any injury, they need to be able to, they've got all their strength measures back, they've got their range back, but they need to be able to hop propulsively. So there's a big jump from doing all your calf work to suddenly then hopping. So this is a nice plyometric activity that can, progressively build them up, to a running action. And even though that's, we're thinking of runners there, dancers do need to run as well. So, it's really applicable to both populations. But I've found it's been a fantastic part of all our rehabs, but we'll also use it as a conditioning exercise, even in uninjured, as a prevention exercise.
And the frequency, I mean, you've just mentioned you can use this for conditioning. The frequency of conditioning versus rehab might be what, once a week, twice a week?
Yeah, so if they're really on a, got a serious injury and they're off and they're right at the very beginning and they're only doing stepping, they could do it every day.
Yeah.
But as they build up the speed and the intensity, then it could drop. So once they've started jogging, perhaps then they're every second day. And then once they start running or they start getting into their jumping in their class, then they could bring it back to a couple of times a week and maybe as a maintenance dose once a week. But I do find the dancers, when we talk about maintenance doses of strengthening, they do lose it just with once a week. I find they do need to keep a couple of sessions in per week for most of their exercises. So yeah, so that's often I mean it's not really exciting, this exercise, especially if you're in a stairwell. So I certainly get them to get outside. And often outside you can find a place with nice big steps, especially for those guys with the big feet.
Yep.
So yeah, Sydney Opera House is a ripper. If anyone's in Sydney, they're brilliant stairs for stair running. And then another aspect of any rehab is that we always make sure that at every 6 weeks we have a recovery week. So during the recovery week, and we do this with all the dancers all the time, they rather than reducing, so you can either do two things. You can either reduce the repetitions by about 50%, or you can reduce the load by 50%. And we found that it was much easier to reduce the repetitions. It made it a quicker exercise program. And then when they go back, once they get to their following week, they're much more likely, if they've kept those loads up, they're happy just to get the reps up again. Whereas if you drop the load down, they sort of feel like they've got to build up that load again in that second week. So kind of waste 2 weeks. So yeah, so we get them to half all the reps of all their exercises. Now we can't fiddle too much, obviously, with what they're doing during their training, with their learning their choreography. We can certainly get them to half the number of repetitions in their class, but even by reducing their exercises seems to be a good strategy to just give them a little bit of recovery. Now, you'll often find, especially in a rehab, by about the 5th week, they'll either go two ways. They'll be like really fatiguing, and you go, okay, let's bring it in a week early if you're starting to fatigue. Or they'll be going, I feel fantastic, like I just want to progress. Don't stop me now. And if you ignore this need to recover, they will suffer. And so it's that really, I mean, if they experience what it feels like, they'll never do it again. But yeah, just trying to really ensure that they do take that break, even though they're feeling fantastic, because that is a very common barrier that we find, like, I want to get that next step in. I'm really feeling fantastic. But it's like, no, you'll feel even better if you have this week of and we don't need to back off your ballet. We'll just maintain it. We won't increase it. We won't add any more complexity or intensity to it. We're going to maintain that for 1 week, but we're going to drop all your exercises back. And
And
that
that's for the
seems to work well.
that was for the rehabilitating athlete, is that right, Sue? Or is that in the uninjured cohort?
Yeah, so uninjured as well
Sorry,
that would
uninjured
be
as
our
well.
yeah, would
Okay.
be our approach.
So just periodizing the workload, uh,
Yeah.
no matter whether they're rehabilitating or not.
And we'll sort of plan ahead, but as we're coming up to the next 6 week mark, we'll look at what they've got because it might be inconvenient. Like if they're maybe that 5th week is when they're traveling and they're not going to get to the gym. And so maybe it's better to do it that week. So we'll certainly look ahead and try to align it with other commitments. Maybe it's a busy performance week, and so that'd be an ideal time maybe to pull it back. Or maybe the week before they have something coming up, it's really hard. Like the dancers really hate dropping off intensity, the whole taper. They just that just feels so wrong to them. That is just something that has never been done where you taper back. But when you actually explain to them, you are actually doing a taper. When by the time you get to that week before a performance, you're running it. You're not doing all the repeating over and over again, which they've been doing leading up to that. So actually the way it's done is a semi-taper in that they do it once or twice in the day, whether they've been doing it perhaps 5 or 6 times. They run it once or twice, that's it. And that sort of is the typical, and then another cast goes on. So that is, they do actually do a taper, but they just need to be educated because they don't even notice that that's what's happening.
Yeah, wow, fascinating. Not something you naturally think of, I guess, in the professional dancing population that there's taperings occurring, and but of course it makes sense when you spell that out, Sue. So just to tidy up a couple of great points you've shared, going right back to the posterior capsule that you said can be so often the cause of performers or athletes' posterior ankle symptoms or hindfoot symptoms. What role do medications play, such as anti-inflammatories, if there is a bit of an effusion or indeed inflammation of the capsule?
Yeah, great question. Absolutely. We would use those if it's not settling. So obviously, I think synovitis is the most common thing I would treat, and that's inflammation of that capsule. So it really responds well to anti-inflammatories. But the mistake people make is that they just sort of gobble one here and gobble one there and don't do it properly. So if they're going to, they really need to, stay on it for a few days. We wouldn't give a full dose to start with, and obviously this is all led by the doctor. So the doctor would sort of prescribe a medium dose to start with, because sometimes that's enough. Like you don't want to go full dose if a medium dose is going to work. And so then you got, if it's not working, then you could up the dose, or if it's working really well, then you then might just need a few days and then taper it off. But I often find with a significant injury that it needs, at least a week of having, at least a medium dose of anti-inflammatories. But then often people just go cold turkey and stop them. So I definitely would, I think it's better just to taper the anti-inflammatories off over a few days. But we wouldn't have someone on it for more than, a couple of weeks. So I think, doing it properly for a short amount of time is far better than just having one here and there, because you're not really, they're probably just reducing pain. They're probably not getting the true anti-inflammatory benefit if they're just having a tablet here and there. So I think, yeah, doing it properly for a short amount of time, then getting off it. And if they found that, they've really get a fantastic result, and then as soon as they come off it, it returns. I mean, you're evaluating to see what you've missed. Is there something else that you could be throwing at this? Have they been icing, for example, because, the joint does feel hot and, inflamed. So just that can give them a bit of pain relief. But yeah, if their pain just keeps coming back, you're making sure that you haven't missed anything in your management. But it might mean that they do need to consider a cortisone injection. So we would never jump in straight with that. We would have always, they've always had the perfect rehab, all their strengths there. They've tried some anti-inflammatory, so it can be diagnostic too. So if they've had a great response from anti-inflams, you take them away, the pain comes back, you can be pretty confident that it might be synovitis. But before we do a cortisone, we'd certainly at that point be imaging to see that we're not missing anything that wouldn't respond to anti-inflammatory and could even be dangerous. So, for example, if you've got a really big cartilage defect, you know, repeated cortisone could actually, cause that to deteriorate. So, unlikely to be too much of a problem if it's just, the one, and certainly letting someone go back without their full range of movement is probably more of a problem than, a one cortisone. We certainly wouldn't recommend having them without a rehab, which is another key thing. So my approach post cortisone, I mean, cortisone can be a fantastic diagnosis because they have the anesthetic at the same time. So as soon as just before they've had the cortisone injection with the anesthetic in it, they do, for example, with posterior ankle pain, they might do a dorsiflexion lunge, or they might do a rise, a single leg heel raise. They measure their pain. We look at the range of movement. And then at about 20 minutes after the injection, we'll get them to reassess it. If they leave it longer than 1 hour, the anesthetic will have worn off. But if they do it too quickly, it's hasn't had its anesthetic effect. So I say at about 20 minutes post-injection to reassess. So there's a fantastic part of your diagnosis where you're getting confirmation that that region is probably the source of their symptom. If it's improved their range and or it's limited, reduced their pain a little bit. It won't take it away completely, but it should have changed it. So if there's no change, then obviously it probably indicates that that's not the source of their symptom and you need to keep hunting. But the imaging can certainly help to guide where that fluid's coming from. So the fluid might be coming from the ankle joint or the subtalar joint. It might have sort of come back into the posterior recess of the either of those joints. So that can really help to guide where we need to target with a cortisone injection.
And those anti-inflammatories, Sue, you mentioned led by the doctor. So they are typically prescription based versus over the counter.
Well, I mean, they're pretty much, Voltaren, I think it's just a little cheaper if it's prescribed. So, but it's the same
Yeah.
drug. Yeah,
Yeah. Okay.
Andrew usually uses Voltaren because it's, I think, a bit more gentle on the stomach.
Yep. Okay, that's great. And then to the other two clarifying questions there, with the stair work, you mentioned for the athletes that have long feet, it can be tricky depending on the width of the step. And there is safety considerations there. If someone can't access wide steps, clinically, having learnt this from yourself quite a few years ago, I've told patients just to go down the stairs safely and go back up. Is there any other way to do it?
Yeah, I mean, if their toes come off a little bit, it's okay because you're sort of weight bearing in your shoe, and you should have like good runners on with, well padded front of the foot. Doesn't matter too much about how healthy the heel of the shoe is because they're up on the,
Mhm.
but yeah, they can have their toes off just a little bit. But yeah, if they're giant feet and it looks unsafe, they can certainly get a good workout from just going up the stairs and then coming carefully down. And even coming down, like that's great work through the whole foot and calf complex. But it's often I'll get them just to ignore the metronome a little bit and just slow it down as they're coming down when they're trying to get that build up that skill.
Yeah. Because the athlete's running at 200 beats per minute. Are they going down at 200 beats per minute? Oh my
Yes.
gosh. That's
It sounds fast, but when you actually see these people that are great runners doing it, it doesn't look so challenging.
yeah, but it's still impressive. And then Sue, with the bone stress injury side of things, repeat imaging even if they're asymptomatic at 6 weeks, or only for those that are symptomatic or the high risk sites.
Yeah, just only for high risk. Just your standard metatarsal, like second metatarsal, if it's in the shaft, we would I mean, occasionally we might not even image if they settle down within that first week or so. So we would only image them if they remain symptomatic if so you're palpating, you're testing them with hopping and running, you know, if it's only the high risk that we might consider it. And even saying that, the base is second, clinically, we're pretty confident that we can, we don't want to see swelling. We want the palpation to be clear. They want to be able to hop, really propulsively hop without any pain. Generally that's enough.
Okay, so that's great. Sue, there is so much wealth of information you've just shared, and I want to try and help the listener just bring in some key concepts. I'll be listening back to this with another pen and paper by my side, but just in general terms, if we break it down into two categories, the athletes listening in and then the practitioners listening. And I know there's a lot you could say on this question, but do your best to come up with some bullet points. What would be the three top keys you'd give to the practitioners listening on how to assess the foot and ankle well? And these are broad categories, I appreciate, not specific conditions. What are the three must do's?
Yeah, I think really assessing the subtalar joint and the midfoot. I think clinicians are great at looking at the ankle, but often I'm looking at the subtalar joint and its contribution. Most often it's stiff. But the people that I've found that sort of haven't responded to their management have been the ones where it's been a bit of subtle instability. I think there's this myth that it's only sort of those flexibility sports that have instability in the joints. And you can have for example, with subtalar joint, it can be stiff. Like if you do a glide, a medial or a lateral glide, it can be quite stiff in one direction, but very loose in the other direction. So I think just really being mindful and really feeling the movement around these joints and just yeah, just using sort of often see physios when they're mobbing sort of through the ankle. It's just pretty gross sort of movements and someone's, not feeling the end feel, go back to those basics, really concentrate on what you're feeling, really think about the joint that you're mobilizing. And the midfoot region is very complex, and it's really important in walking. So if they've got stiffness through that area or instability through that area, that can really be a bit of tricky to manage, but it also needs to be assessed. So building up your skills, looking at the foot as well is, I think, something that the physio, I'm hoping now that I'm involved in helping develop this curriculum will really improve the time that's spent on the foot. I think, when I went through, and most of us have gone through, very little time was spent teaching how to assess and treat a foot. So I think we really need to get back to the basics and understand the anatomy and understand the movement of these joints.
So that's some great tips for the practitioners. Assess the subtalar joint, assess the midfoot, build
Hmm.
up your skills / get re-familiar with your anatomy,
Yeah,
or go back to Latrobe where Sue's now teaching,
that's true.
or attend an upcoming foot and ankle course, which I'll be trying to clear my schedule for August 2025 in Queensland to attend your 2-day
Awesome.
course. But that's great. And then, Sue, for the athlete performer, maybe Sue Mays's 3 key tips for managing their foot and ankle injuries. And it's almost an impossible question because it's so broad, but just principles.
Yeah, I think having good footwear that you're regularly getting checked, and often see people in really old shoes that have lost their support. I think the foot will function better if it's got a bit of support, but there's also evidence to support that if you're in a shoe without support, you do build up intrinsics. But I think any of these changes, any change you make to your program needs to be very gradual. And if you're suddenly going to start wearing a shoe that doesn't have support or perhaps running on your forefoot, you need this, I would suggest, rather than using that to build up your strength, strengthen up your calf, strengthen up your foot first before you start to make these changes. But very subtle changes as you sort of build up your program. But can't stress enough how important strengthening up the foot muscles and the calf, soleus and the gastroc is.
Yeah, great. So strengthen up the foot calf, make progressive, subtle, gradual changes to workload, and
Exactly.
think about having good footwear
Yes.
available. Practical, simple, but effective. So every guest of this show is asked to issue a physical challenge to the listener. It's been like this for over 7 to 9 years, episodes over 350 now. What is Sue Mays's physical challenge to the listener going to be?
Well, I think everyone should have a go at the stair running. So keeping that heel, even videoing yourself from the back, from the bottom of the stairs, because it's challenging to keep that heel really still and not let it bob around. So we're looking for very isometric, that heel not going up and down, also not rolling in and out. We don't want bouncing. We want to, and I'd never actually say this to an athlete, but we are trying to develop stiffness. There's a lot of talk about stiffness, but the moment I thought we learned it with the lumbar spine. We told everyone to be really stiff through the lumbar and it didn't work. So I don't say I want you to be stiff. I'll use other cues, but that's what we're trying to develop with this stair running, is that sort of ability to be really, stiff through this area, but with strength. And so, for example, with a dancer who knows music, I might say, I want you to do it with a real staccato action.
Mhm.
And if they know music, it's like really sort of quite stiff, quite sharp sort of movement where there's not too much with real accent. So yeah, just I think the stairs would be a really good challenge.
Yeah, that's great. So anyone taking it on, you can tag it up over on the socials at Physical Performance Show and we'll reshare it. The Sue
Yes.
Mays Stair Running Challenge. Are you going to set a metronome frequency for that, Sue, or let people
Who can get up to
self-discover?
200 beats a minute for 20 minutes?
Wow. All right. If you get to 20 minutes, 200 beats per minute, please let the show know. We'll let Sue know as well. And then, Sue, in line with that, a set question that every guest has been asked over the years is that's your physical challenge for the week. But if you could boil everything you've learned through your extensive career, research, PhD, elite level sport consulting, all your 30 years at the Australian Ballet into one piece of advice to help people in general perform at their physical best, what would that one piece of advice be, Sue?
Ooh. I think I think from a clinician's point of view, developing that rapport with your athletes. So, trust is everything. And getting the trust of your athlete is so important. You can have all these fancy techniques, but unless your athlete really trusts what you're saying, and that trust comes through demonstrating success, but also demonstrating your knowledge. So, having the evidence to support what you're saying, but being really holistic about it. And then for an athlete, I think just having hope and knowing that the body is quite amazing at healing. And we just need to give it the right stimulus and the right support. But it's very rare for me to see someone fail. You know, I've seen some terrible injuries and people have come back from them. So just, as long as you've got the right supports, the right advice, evidence-based support, there's very few injuries that can't be managed effectively.
Gosh, such a powerful way to close this conversation, Sue. So thank you. Thank you for your generosity in stopping by. And you have been someone that literally has sat on my wish list of people to interview on this show for years. And thanks for the contribution you make to all therapists out there, and then obviously the wider community. So I look forward to seeing you at a course. But Sue, what is upcoming for you? Anywhere that practitioners can specifically, gain some upgrading skills, and then the general population?
Yeah, I've got so Australian Physiotherapy Association run my foot and ankle courses. So I've got one coming up in Perth very soon, Queensland, Victoria. So I've just done the New South Wales ones, but I do those every year. And they're really hands-on. I do provide some of the evidence, but the main focus is really honing the manual techniques and our assessment techniques. And then we finish off with taping and some good rehab skills. So lots of novel techniques, but really, yeah, upskilling in some of the specifics around the foot where, most physios don't have confidence.
Yeah, brilliant. Brilliant. And then the wider population, they're just going to have to go to university to learn more, aren't they, these
That's
days?
right.
But Sue, thank you again. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you very much, Brad.